thing about these books of yours is that you have taken a sharp turn from traditional history. Traditional history is mostly about case studies, like the history of Rome. Hundreds of books have been written about the history of Rome. One thing, one case. You use a tremendous amount of various examples from around the world. How do you think that affects your vision of the things that you... How does that make your work differ from what has been done earlier?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I started life as a sort of mainstream economist, and then I realized that, I was always very passionate about history. That was sort of my favorite subject when I was a schoolboy. So I obsessively read history books, and, I was just intrinsically interested in it. But then, I started university in England in 1979, and Mrs. Thatcher had just come to power. And I was also very interested in politics, but then I'd go to political, it was a very exciting moment actually. And I'd go to political meetings, and everyone would be talking about the money supply, and I had no idea what the money supply was and why anyone cared about it. So I thought, I better learn about this. I better learn about economics. So I actually went to study political science at the London School of Economics, and then political science just seemed to be the most boring thing on the planet. It just was very descriptive. It was like, what they describe as butterfly collecting, like sort of putting names on things. And then
stamp collecting. Stamp collecting.
And stamp collecting. And I've been trying to teach myself economics. And then there was a course for political scientists which was using for economics for political scientists, was using exactly the same book I'd read myself. And I was like, I'm not reading that book again. I already read it. So let's see what the economists are doing. So then I went to see what the economists were doing, and it was a class taught by a Japanese mathematical economist called Mikio Morishima. It was a sort of institution at the LSE. He taught this for about 40 years. And it was amazing. It was about everything. It was about, the first book we read was Max Weber's Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, and then we read Schumpeter, and then, he talked about everything. He talked about why central planning failed. He talked about the Meiji Restoration and post-war Japanese industry. It was just this, and I thought, oh my gosh, economics is really about all these exciting things. Of course, that's not true. But I thought it was. So I dropped political science, and I remember the day, I decided I'm not doing this anymore. And the gentleman was discussing the Belgian electoral system. Now, the Belgian electoral system is a thing of beauty and great intricacy. But at the time, I thought, who cares about the Belgian electoral system? Let's go back to the Meiji Restoration. So I was, and I think, for me, I've always had these things, and I think Professor Acemoglun and I, we've been working together for sort of 30 years now, and it's 31 years ago we met each other, and we sort of got together because we had the same impulse, which was, okay, so then I kind of went down this road of becoming an economist, doing a degree in economics, doing a PhD in economics, and I sort of had this, there's all these things I'm really interested in, So I was in economics, kind of learning all this mathematics and then reading history books, in my spare time, guiltily, it's kind of looking at pornography or something, on the side at night, in the library and all this other stuff. And then we got together because we had exactly the same sort of impulse, which was, look, there's all these things that we're really interested in, politics and history, and then there's economics. And so we kind of know how to do things in economics. We know how to write papers and but what about all this stuff? Isn't that relevant? And I remember one of the sort of things that really cemented this, this especially kind of opened up this sort of Pandora's box of history, was we were at a conference very early on in our sort of intellectual relationship, and there was a chap talking about why Haiti was a poor country. And then he had data from income per capita from 1970 to whatever it was, at 1990 or something. And we both looked at each other. We walked out of the room and said, how could you possibly understand why Haiti was a poor country by looking at income per capita since 1970? This is a long-run historical, process. It goes back to slavery and so then that sort of triggered this, so I think like then we just worked very hard to kind of bring all of this stuff into the research. It took us a bit of time to figure out how to do that, but.
Well, you come up with these parameters or features of society like inclusiveness and extractiveness, and you explain how the system works with these two parameters in this book.
Yeah. And
in the other book, you have chaos and tyranny as the parameters in the narrow corridor. Why do you just take two? The world is multidimensional, not two-dimensional.
Well, the thing about Why Nations Fail is that, we wrote a lot of kind of scientific papers published in journals, but, those papers, they're written in a sort of very kind of impenetrable academic style. And also, in this process of sort of reading history and bringing history into what we were doing, mostly editors in economics journals just basically like delete the history. They don't care about that, like get to the model or get to the data or whatever. So then, we sort of thought like all these historical episodes and case studies that we ourselves have found so kind of inspiring. They've made us they've generated ideas. They've made us think about the world. And, if we found them inspiring, maybe other people will find them inspiring too.
They're
so that
beautiful.
was sort of one of the motivations. But you need a simple framework for kind of relating them to each other, and that was this idea of extractive and inclusive institutions, that there's this massive dichotomy between successful and unsuccessful societies, that successful societies are inclusive in the sense of like kind of being able to tap into all the kind of latent talent that there is in them. And extractive societies aren't. Inclusive societies create broad-based incentives and opportunities, and extractive societies don't. So I think, that's a sort of egregiously simplistic dichotomy, but it turns out to be very useful for developing the argument, and it was a way of kind of putting a collective structure on all these examples. Yeah.
And for the reader, it's very, it simplifies. You don't have to learn all of these concepts and difficult ideas. You just have these two things and you just put them on the graph.
Yeah.
Figure it out. The same thing with the narrow corridor. You have this beautiful line coming between the tyranny and the chaos.
Yeah, there were several reasons for that, that sort of extension of the argument, which is one, we have this diagram and we sort of say, there's, instead of two sorts of societies, there's three sorts of society, and we try to reconstruct that through the balance of power between the state and society. So the state can dominate society, think China. Society can dominate the state, Yemen, many places in sub-Saharan Africa, or you can have this balance, And I think what we liked about that a lot is, first of all, it allowed us to talk about a lot of mechanisms that we couldn't talk about in Why Nations Fell. Because, in Why Nations Fell, Yemen and China both have extractive institutions, which is true in a sense, but you can see that Yemen and China are also radically different societies. And in particular, if you want to build more inclusive institutions, that's an extremely different project in Yemen than it is in China. The problem is very different. And also, what we liked about this was it captures more of a sort of process. Like I realized, in talking about Why Nations Fail, that, extracted to inclusive institutions. Like people think it's like this momentum, it's like a moment, or it's like this very rapid change. And I think, you do see societies that change rapidly, but I think often there's a process. This is a historical process, and I think that diagram sort of captures. We like that aspect of it. Yeah.
And you have these lines going. You go into the narrow corridor, then you fall out, and you have to battle to get back in there, and you get out of it forever, like some countries have.
Yeah, I mean the sort of a lot of the emphasis in the book is on, there's these three kind of equilibria in some sense, and some societies tend to these inclusive institutions, other society tends towards the state dominate, so you veer off towards these corners. But you shocks to the system can also kind of knock you out of that. So we, like in some sense, we give this example of Nazi Germany. Some sense, like if you look at the long history of Germany, of course it was relatively inclusive, going back deep to the Middle Ages and whatever, but then. And with Weimar, but then, of course, it gets hit by this disastrous economic shock. The Nazis had 2% of the vote until the economy collapsed, and suddenly they had 30-something%. So then, then it knocks it out of the corridor. So of course, as a social scientist, what I find interesting about that is that, and this is where the kind of persistence comes in. There were 15 disastrous years, but then the Germans were able to kind of recreate this inclusive society. So there was enough common understanding of how we should do things. And there was a kind of recollection, there was a reflection, at least by some people, by the majority of people, that this was a disaster, this thing we got into. But of course, in 15 years, that caused immense chaos and
grievances and so forth. Yes,
yeah.
But they also had help in coming back into the corridor. The Germans,
sure,
a lot of it.
Sure, yeah.
And other peoples, like for instance the Czechs, they also had these 15 years of, or maybe 10 years of bad time, but they didn't have help getting back into it until now.
Yeah.
So you need help to get back in there, even though you feel that you should be able to get into the corridor.
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting question, about how can outsiders help, yes. and you could say Japan had a lot of help, after the Second World War, but I think the evidence also shows it's sort of difficult to help. Maybe the European Union helped many countries in the former Soviet bloc become much more inclusive, after 1990, but, you can see even in Eastern Europe, that's it's a work in progress. And in other parts of the world, of course, attempts to move societies, in a kind of more democratic or inclusive direction are hopelessly failed. Think about Afghanistan, hopelessly. Yes. I'm not sure it's hopelessly failed. My sense of that is, Afghanistan is a different place than it was when the Americans invaded. At least women, there's 20 years of women got education, women had employment opportunities, they had, that's a different society than when the Americans first went there. I don't want to defend anything that the Americans did. I think the whole thing was mostly a total and utter disaster. In Iraq, even worse. But there were some good things that happened. Yeah.
What do you think about the situation in Sweden now? 5 years ago, people here, no one would have thought that there would be an army in the streets, or they even talk about army in the streets in Sweden today.
Yeah, I guess my take on this, given where I do research, is that the Swedes were sort of living in a bit of a bubble.
You sort of you praise the Swedish system quite a lot in these books.
Yeah, you can't. It's very hard to sort of sustain a society which is so functional with so little crime, and when you're surrounded, in the world by crime, and and there's huge incentives to create that in Sweden if you can do it, and you have a police and a kind of that's not calibrated to deal with that. The police don't have guns, and we kind of went through this in England 30 years ago. So I think probably the Swedes are just kind of waking up and converging to something that's probably more normal. You can't, it's difficult to isolate yourself from such a, of course, the transition is very difficult though.
One idea that comes to mind is these people who are immigrants in Sweden, they don't have the same social opportunities that the Swedes have. And it takes a long time to get assimilated into the Swedish system, especially if you're not a Christian Protestant, and if you're of color. It's difficult.
It may.
It takes a long time. It takes a long time, as it did in England. If it's even happened in England yet.
Yeah, it's, the migration to England started much earlier, much earlier than it did in Sweden. Like in England, you had a lot of migration starting in the 1930s and 1940s from the Caribbean, and, but even now there's still problems. Yeah, there's still problems in integrating people. I think at least now you see in British politics, you have a lot of, you have black people, you have people of, South Asian descent in politics, and
Prime
so
Minister.
that's
A prime minister.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a great thing. That's a fantastic thing. Yes.
Well, Sweden is our neighbor, but so is Russia. What do you think about Russia then?
I think, that's a failed attempt to create an inclusive society, in some sense, like the and I think there's lots of different ways you could think about that. One way I'd think about it, here in terms of the narrow corridor, we talk about that, we contrast Russia to Poland. In Poland, there was genuine kind of social mobilization, to push this change. In Russia, there was very little of that. The Communist Party sort of collapsed through a crisis of confidence, or whatever you want to call it. And, and then there was all this maneuvering in the 1990s, with a lot of corruption and insider privatization and without that sort of more broader kind of commitment, to create something different. So I think, you could make other arguments. The security services managed to maintain themselves, what's the, and there's no history, think about the Baltics or parts of Eastern Europe. They did have, short, albeit only for 20 years, but between the First and Second World Wars, there were periods of democracy and much more inclusive institutions. So there was something to kind of latch onto and kind of reconstruct and rebuild.
Actually, they had a longer history. They were part of Sweden in the 16 and 1700s, and they had the same thing that we had. We were part of Russia, but we had the Swedish heritage.
Yeah, so maybe there's even deeper things to kind of build on. And, you don't have that history in... You don't have that history in Russia. I mean, I don't want to be too deterministic historically. I think societies can reinvent themselves. When I was a kid, we actually lived in Barbados for 3 years. And Barbados is a kind of remarkable place. If you look at the history of Barbados, it was a slave society. 90% of the population was slaves. And they were the slaves were freed in the 1830s, but then they imposed all these bans that stopped you leaving Barbados, and so you go to Barbados today, it's just an amazingly functional place. It has income per capita of $20,000. The white people speak like the black people. There are still white Bajans, who kind of stayed on. And they speak just like the black people. They've kind of taken on the black culture in the same way that people in New Zealand are now absorbing all this Maori culture and kind of identifying with it. So you can overcome these sort of these histories. And that's I mean, I don't think as social scientists we really understand the circumstances that allows you to overcome that. So I don't want to say, Russia is condemned, to one of my, I was talking about the Enlightenment this afternoon, but Jesse Driscoll, who's a political scientist who's in the United States who studies Central Asia, he just wrote a book on Ukraine. I asked him once, how should I think about Russia? And he said, the first thing you should know about Russia is the Enlightenment never got to Russia, but that's true as a fact, but probably if you look around the world, you see, okay, but, societies can reinvent, people can reinvent themselves, societies can reinvent themselves too,
Well, you've written 2 books now with Daron?
3.
3?
But you haven't translated the other one.
That was the previous book. That was the earlier
It's full of
book. 400
pages of mathematics, so I wouldn't recommend it.
But do you have another project underway?
Well, we do, actually. Well, I mean, I think we do. I was just talking about it at the university this afternoon. So and that's to try to... I think we've never thought in a deep enough way. I think this is sort of, stimulated by what's going on in the world today, and it's kind of forcing us to reflect on, democracy and egalitarianism and are humans, where does this sort of appeal of democracy or where does it come from and how is it reflected in some kind of deeper human history or culture, because I find it sort of puzzling in the sense that, people can be very democratic and they can think about injustice and, they can be egalitarian but humans are also very good at fitting into hierarchies, it seems to me, my favorite example, I'm English people. English people love hierarchy and status, everybody is working for their knighthood and their OBE and their, and if you so here's an exercise you can do. If you join the British Airways Frequent Flyer Club, there's a pop-down menu and you have to choose your title. And this enormous thing comes down with the entire British social structure, and class structure. And it's globalized, so you can be Sheikh if you want. If you want to be Sheikh, you can be Sheikh. And you come on the plane, they say, welcome, Sheikh Robinson. Okay, so I think I'm professor. So humans are very good at fitting into hierarchy and justifying hierarchy. The political philosopher Michael Sandel has a very nice book about this called The Tyranny of Merit, where he basically says, Americans have constructed this hierarchy supposedly based on merit, but most of that is a sort of chimera. Who gets into Harvard? And I know because I used to teach at Harvard. Half the students are just there because their parents gave money to Harvard. And so they're not there because of superior effort. They're there because you can manage. Like my eldest son, he wasn't doing so well at school. He wants to get into this university. What do? You go and pay $5,000 to these people who coach them to the test, and he passed the test and he got into the university he wanted to get into. But I have $5,000 to do that. Lots of people don't have $5,000 to do that. So there's something kind of phony about this. And Michael Sandel says it's an ideology that sort of justifies the inequality in the United States. So I think the thing we're playing with is this. Humans are able to think about the world through this kind of egalitarian lens, but they can also think of it through a hierarchical lens, and so we're trying to think of that kind of interplay between these two ways of looking at the world, and we can change the way we're looking at the world. I'd say what's the problem in the United States at the moment is that many people are moving from a kind of commitment to a democratic vision of society to something different. I'm not quite sure they know what it is. That's what the Republicans are kind of competing to provide, that model of what it is. I think they're confused about what it is, but they're searching for something else.
For a new America. Who knows?
I don't. It's frightening.
Would you like to ask questions? No questions? Just ask.
Yeah,
with a loud voice.
Yes, so there are some historians like Neil Ferguson now talking about the Second Cold War between China and the US. What do you think about this situation, this great rivalry now emerging, and does it fit into your narrative in the book? And what are the advantages and disadvantages of each side that might contribute to the ultimate victory?
Yeah, so we have a kind of quite controversial view about Chinese economic growth. And so one of the things that people criticize our work for is not paying enough attention to these sort of international relations. I think the way we think about this is there are moments in history like European colonialism. European colonialism goes around the world kind of having a massive impact on societies in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia. And so that's a moment where somehow international relations kind of heavily shapes, societies. But I guess in our view, those moments are that's not kind of quotidian international relations, And I think, my own excuse for ignoring things like this is whenever I've worked in a country or tried to understand its sort of economic or political dynamics, it's always the domestic dynamics that sort of, loom very large. When I first went, I worked in Colombia. My wife is Colombian. I've worked and taught in Colombia for 30 years, And when I first went to Colombia, one narrative, it's it's the World Bank or it's the CIA or it's the Americans or the United Fruit Company or whatever. But then you realize that that's all nonsense. It might be there, but that's not the big show. That's not the action, And I think every case I looked at, I worked the first place in Africa I worked in seriously was in Botswana, and I met I met these political scientists in the United States, and I was asking them about Botswana, and they said, of course Botswana's successful. The South Africans run everything. It's total nonsense. It turns out the South Africans didn't run anything. The Swana people, the Botswana ran the show, and they made the decisions, and they made the success story. So I kind of it's always about. I've always maybe it's just it's like a kind of blind spot or something, but I've always convinced myself that it's these kind of internal dynamics are important. I think on this China case, I think there's two things I have to say. One thing is, many scholars of kind of the international relations of China will tell you China has no kind of hegemonic project, the way the British Empire was. That if you look at the history of China are happy to have all these tributary relations like Korea. China could have, the Qing dynasty could have invaded Korea and annexed it. Wasn't interested. The Koreans paid tribute and sort of said, Tibet, same thing, like for hundreds of years. If you go to the old city in Beijing, there's like a Tibetan temple where the Tibetans would come every year and bring like stuff to kind of, okay, we recognize you're superior and whatever, and then we go back to Tibet, But the Chinese never annexed it. Of course, they did annex parts of Central Asia and stuff, but like that view is, no, China has a very different kind of way of thinking about this. So I think that's interesting. It's worth taking. I'm not enough of a scholar of China to know if that's true, but people certainly say that. And and the other thing I would say, our argument in Why Nations Fail is like, China, you can't sustain a modern inclusive economy at the whim of a dictatorship. Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I think like what you see now in China is a consolidation of a personal political project. Like they're teaching President Xi's philosophy at schools nowadays. And I think, if you don't have to just look, you don't have to look at Chinese history. You look at any history to know that that's a disaster waiting to happen. I don't know when it's going to happen or what is going to happen, but I don't think that's a sustainable situation. So I don't think China is going to become a developed country, honestly. It's going to collapse, We don't know how it's going to collapse. And, and obviously the consequences for the world of that are going to be absolutely tectonic, orders of magnitude more than the problems with Ukraine, or it's going to be a disaster. But I'm pretty sure it's going to happen. I'm trying to convince the University of Chicago of this at the moment, actually, because many American universities have developed this business model, which is basically selling degrees to Chinese students. I don't know if you have that in Finland, but it's a disaster, So that like we have to kind of hedge our bets against that collapsing. It's completely reliant on the economic dynamism of the Chinese economy, and of course the Chinese government allowing these people to go overseas. They're already discouraging students to study overseas because they don't like them coming to America and like getting their heads full of all these ideas.
You talked about Niall Ferguson and Harry Farrell and Farrell and Newman have written a book, the Underground Empire, where they talk about weaponized mutual dependence. America controls the patents for electronics, controls the money system, and it controls the internet. And now the Farrell and Newman say that these are the weapons America is using against everybody, the whole world. And America sort of controls these things. And these are the most important things in the world right now. And the BRICS countries hate it. And they're trying to sort of get themselves free from these three American mutual dependencies.
Okay.
Do you have an idea? Have you heard of this, or do you have an idea about this? Or
I haven't really thought about it. I'm sure that's true. Like people would like to get away from the reliance on English as a language. There's one of the legacies of the British Empire.
Yes.
Mea culpa. People would like to get away from the dollar, like dollar everywhere is like dollar, the dollarization, whatever. Of course, you'd like to get away from that, So, but it's difficult. We need to coordinate on a different language to communicate. We need to kind of have trust in a different currency. Maybe the Republicans will mess up, public finance so badly in the United States that everyone will abandon the dollar and switch to something else. But switch to the euro or something like that. But I think like there are these kind of path dependencies in the world, and like once you get into that situation, it's very hard to get yourself out of it. Yeah. So I don't know. Like I'm not. I think the BRICS. Oh my gosh. Like what? Like that's. Like India, China, Brazil, run by a completely corrupt government, Russia, like what a, it's a, I don't know what to think about the BRICS. I'd be surprised if they were capable of like developing a kind of coordinated, sustained policy to achieve something like that. South Africa, again, struggling with its demons. Yeah.
And Argentina has an election going right now.
Argentina, yeah, we love it, yeah. The Peronist candidate who was the Minister of Finance, who's just overseen, one of the most incompetent economic policies, in the history of a country with many, many experiences of incompetent economic policy, won the first round of the presidential election. But that's because the Peronists just get 30% of the vote, and that's it. 30% of Argentinians are Peronists. And, of course, the alternative guy is this completely nutty sort of libertarian.
A real intellectual.
Oh, my gosh, yes. It's interesting. See, that's why social science is interesting. Yeah.
And the world.
And it's more interesting if you're not an Argentine. Yes.
Any more questions? Lisäkysymyksiä?
Has anyone suggested to you that your theory about the development reminds a little bit Karl Marx theory? He has sort of stages in history from feudalism to capitalism, etc., and also of the longer former times. So this is my question.
Yeah.
No.
No, I don't think it's very Marxist because, there's nothing inevitable about these transitions. Like in Marx, there were these stages of history, but there's, like every society was going to basically become socialist in the end. No, I mean, like, you develop to capitalism and, from feudalism to capitalism. And I don't believe that because, I don't think, well, first of all, history doesn't end in that kind of way, it seems to me. And I don't think there's anything inevitable about all societies becoming kind of inclusive, I think, unfortunately. I think that's logically possible for all societies to be inclusive, which is different from some theories, like dependency theory would sort of say the only reason you can have some societies being inclusive is that they're exploiting other societies that are extractive. So I don't believe that. So I think, I think everybody could become inclusive, but I don't think there's anything necessary about that. There's many advantages to a lot of people of being an extractive society. Once, like 6 years ago, I was doing this field work in Zimbabwe in southern Africa, and I was just talking to a lot of people, and one of my friends at the World Bank said, "Oh, you have to meet this lady who's the CEO of like Nestle, Nestle." So Nestle is a big thing in Zimbabwe because there's all these cows and, they buy milk and stuff like that. But all the cows are owned by political elites and stuff like that. So being CEO of Nestle in Zimbabwe is a difficult thing. So we're sitting at breakfast, arguing about like what's going on. Like me. And then at some point she just looks at me and said, like, "Look, I don't understand what your problem is. Like, what is it that you don't understand? Look, there is plenty of money in this country for 300 people, and I'll tell you exactly who they are." And then she gets this bit of paper out, and she starts. Of course, she didn't tell me who the 300 were. 100 of them were like elites in the ZANU-PF, the leading party, and the other 200 were military officers. Okay, so like that, but they're doing fine. They're doing just fine in Zimbabwe. That was her point. The other 10 million people are not doing fine. But the 300 people are doing fine, So I think, and it's been like that, since 1980. 43 years. That's not a big piece of human history. But I don't think there's any inevitable progress in history and things like that. And I think, like, look at the United States, and this is I was talking a little bit this afternoon. I think like you get reversals in history, and I think like we give the example of Venice in the book, in some sense, which might have been the most prosperous place in the world in the late medieval period, and then just went into reverse. It kind of suffered this massive oligarchization of the political system, and they abolished the very economic institutions that had made Venice prosperous. They made it illegal to use it. So why? To kind of cut the system down, to close the system out. And why wouldn't that happen in the United States? Of course it could. It could happen. It could happen anywhere. So I think that's things can go into reverse. Like we know, look at history. Rome, you mentioned Rome. Rome went into reverse. Something not that similar played out, over a long span, from Caesar's coup.
Ups and downs.
Yeah. So I mean, many places went like that. So I think, we were, yeah.
Yeah. Now, I think our time's up. Or do you have questions? Yes.
So earlier you mentioned that there are these forces that can knock you off from an equilibrium towards chaos and different equilibrium. Well, when I think about these different forces, they are maybe like civil war, economic depression, hyperinflation, external invasion. So what do you think might be, are there some forces that are maybe most commonly observed when these type of knockouts or knockoffs happen? What are the, or maybe one of course is diseases, like like we had recently, but maybe in the past, like plagues and things like that. So
I think there's very heterogeneous responses to that. That's actually one of the things we discuss in like the Black Death. In some sense, the Black Death that wipes out maybe half of the population of Europe in the 14th century. It looks like a calamity, and of course it was, but actually it destroyed a lot of the kind of extractive institutions of feudalism. Like in Britain, serfdom collapsed in the wake of the Black Death, basically. So you can get a shock like that, and you can get very different responses to that shock. I think that's what's interesting. So I was mentioning earlier, the collapse of the German economy, is like clearly had something to do with the rise of the Nazi Party. I think had the German economy not collapsed after the Wall Street crash, Hitler was on 2% of the vote, and then suddenly he was on 35% of the vote. So that can't be a coincidence, I don't think. But economic crises in another place. Look at what happened in the United States. You had the New Deal. You had much more of a commitment. To you had the Wagner Act, a kind of systematic protection of workers' rights. You had Social Security. So you got a very different response, a much more kind of progressive response, and the kind of expansion of the authority of the state, So I think that's, you get these shocks, but they're somehow like very sensitive on initial conditions in a way that's very difficult to conceptualize. So I think it's very hard to predict, what the impact of a particular crisis is going to be. And then you have places like Argentina, which lurches from crisis to crisis, and it seems kind of like the basic problem seems to be impervious to these crises. Every 10 years or 20 years, there's a massive crisis in Argentina where everyone says, "Oh, now it has to change," and it doesn't. So I don't quite understand how the Peronist Party is so immune to these crises. They're able to kind of interpret it or reinterpret it as, somebody else's fault or somebody else is responsible for it, and somehow that gains traction in people's minds. So I think, we can look at case studies and we can look at, here's the crisis, but it's hard to make general statements, unfortunately. That's the problem in social science.
If someone would ask you, who are the actors furthering inclusive institutions, church, philosophers, trade union movement, human rights movement, there are very many possibilities. Which of these actors do you think is sort of most important in when you try to explain who are the actors or who are the persons, who are the organizations sort of?
Well, I think that differs in different contexts. If you think of like I thought about the history of democracy or inclusion in Britain. One of the biggest impulses behind that, was the new model army in the Civil War. Which was when the Civil War started, there was no army in England, and so they both this was like the first professional army basically that Parliament started. And it operated on extremely democratic principles, and out of the new model army came this group like the Levelers that essentially pushed for, they pushed for the execution of the king, but they also pushed for, universal suffrage. So that was, ideas came, but like that was much more a kind of democratic organization that they then sort of projected into the whole society. So then that was very different from the French Revolution, where you could say, ideas preceded the French Revolution. Voltaire and Rousseau and Diderot, the encyclopedias, like this idea of like rights and the kind of like the injustice of inequality, and that came first, and then it gave people a way of interpreting what the problem with the old regime was. So I think, but in other circumstances, it's different. The trade union movement, especially in England at least, was extremely important in organizing and pushing for democracy. And, I think that was less about a battle of ideas, because I think by the time that happens in the second half of the 19th century, the kind of the intellectual battle for democracy had sort of been won. It was just like a rearguard action by elites kind of trying to sort of, okay, well, we can't let these people vote or that, so it was, but that was only going in one direction. So that was more about collective action, striking, protesting, and so I think it's different. It depends on different moments and different problems. So I don't have a simple, I think they're all important in different moments and different contexts. And I think like one of the most important things for me at the moment, in the United States, is trying to understand, like, if we understand like what the problem is better, perhaps we'll know, who's the most important people to get organized here.
Yes, thank you very much for your books and writings. Very, very fascinating, really. I have one question which is not maybe so easy, but maybe it's easy for you. If we are looking at the states and countries that really have a genuine democratic rule and a state based on rule of law, the amount of these countries is diminishing, as you know, according to different evaluations. Now we see what has happened in Turkey and Hungary and Poland and so on. Maybe now Poland a little bit better, but do you think that the growing inequality in these societies might be one of the core reasons for this trend? And it's really quite worrying that thinking about the global world order, that we have only something like 20 or 22 real democracies in the world.
Yeah, I think that's, I don't have like conclusive evidence, but I think it's highly plausible that that's got to do with this massive increase in inequality. I think what's interesting in the United States is that like most people don't resent the fact that Bezos and Musk and all these people are so rich, because I do think like people, this is the sort of American obsession, like they think those people, like, they work all the time, they're like very brilliant, okay. But what they're upset about is we're not moving in that direction at all. If you look at median wages, like average wages in the United States have been stagnant for 40 years, so ordinary middle-class people, like their children aren't moving ahead in the same way they moved ahead relative to their parents. The social mobility has fallen, So of course, we may think as economists, well, like those things are related to each other. The fact that these people are so rich is because, trade unions collapsed. Workers, there's huge monopsony power in labor markets. Like those two things are not unrelated. But I think in the mind of most American voters, they're not economists, so they don't see it hard to connect those things. They just like to be like that. They'd like to move ahead. They'd like to be, and they're not. And so I think, and that's obviously part of this discontent. I think that's absolutely right. I think. All of these cases are very difficult, like the Philippines, like that case is extremely difficult. The guy who's Duterte, like now it's his successor, but it's like hand-picked successor, the son of like Marcos, Ferdinand and Isabella Marcos. It's like, Duterte, it's something different. That's not about inequality. It's really about sort of order, He was the mayor of this Davao city in the south of Mindanao, in which sort of became this paragon of order in the Philippines. You know, like Manila is like a mess, you know. But Davao City, I've actually been in Davao City. You know, like people used to say, you know, you could eat your lunch off the pavement, you know. So there were no criminals, you know, the place was very clean, it was very orderly, it was very safe. How did he achieve that? The same way the guy in El Salvador is doing it, basically like killing people and, you know, putting everyone in prison, extremely draconian. And what's the success of his project? The success of that project is people in Manila thinking, boy, you know, we'd like some of that in Manila. You know, so what's that got to do with Trump? And, you know, this is something we're all struggling with. You know, it's clearly there's something which is sort of delegitimizing the alternative. It's sort of like, okay, that's very high. This is a very hierarchical, very kind of draconian model, but we're gonna go for it, you know. And that's something to do with sort of losing faith in democracy as a solution to our problems. I think most of us have been struggling to understand the commonalities between all of these cases. But I agree with you. I think it's very difficult. You know, democracy is fundamentally about, you know, equality of political rights and political access. And that's got to be connected to equality of economic outcomes and equality of opportunity. And like, you know, so you lose one, the other becomes unstable. So I think that's got to be right. Although there are these cases that you know, and then, you know, think about Turkey, then you have these other kind of cleavages, you have these religious cleavages, which again is something different, and yeah.
Very difficult.
Plenty of work to do, yes.
And to write books about them.
We'll let's see.
Any more questions? Well, thank you very much for this discussion. And,
okay, my pleasure.
We
yes.
have a book signing opportunity over there for those who want to buy a book. And thank you once